The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us for our cross-cloud collaboration webinar between Microsoft clouds. We will wait for a couple more minutes to make sure everybody can join. Stand by, and we will be back to get started in just a few. Thanks. All right, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. My name's Karen. I'm with C3 Integrated Solutions. We're super excited that you could join us today for a discussion between Bill Wootton with C3 and Richard Wakeman with Microsoft on cross-cloud collaboration between Microsoft clouds. I see we've got Richard and we've got Bill. Just a couple of housekeeping items before I turn things over to Bill for intros. You're able to ask questions throughout the webinar. You should see a questions panel. Feel free to submit any question that you would like. And we'll hold the questions till the end. Anything that we don't get answered, we'll put together a compilation of responses, and I'll be sending that out to all of the registrants along with a copy of a link to the webinar, which will include the slide deck as well. So you'll get all of this information and then any additional resources after we've wrapped up either today or first thing tomorrow morning. Also, at the very end of the webinar, where there will be a quick survey. So when the webinar ends, if you could just leave your browser window open and answer a couple of questions for us, we would definitely appreciate that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bill and Richard for their introductions. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Karen. My name is Bill Wootton. I'm president and founder of C3 Integrated Solutions. C3 is a managed services provider and system integrator that is dedicated to supporting the defense industrial base. We've been working in the realm of NIST and DFARS and now CMMC for about 5 years now, and part of the original group of AOSG companies that have been transacting and working and deploying in GCC High now for about 5 years now. We're super excited to have Richard here as part of this webinar. It's an incredibly timely topic. It's really, for the entire time we've been working with GCCI, one of the things that we've always been asked and we've always had requests around is, how do I share data across clouds? How do I work with my folks and my friends and colleagues in the other cloud, whether you're going from GCCI to commercial or back the other way? And it's finally here. We're now in the preview piece of it. Richard's going to walk through that in detail, and then we'll circle back with a little bit of a conversation and then open it up to questions. So without further ado, Richard, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. So just as an introduction, I'm the chief architect for our aerospace and defense team within Microsoft. So our team is put into place to assist both our customers and partners, especially those that are within the defense industrial base, with the unique regulations that are in alignment with the U.S. Department of Defense and other highly regulated markets that oftentimes would drive you into the use of our government cloud offerings. So I also represent Microsoft for CMMC in terms of looking at how our customers are able to demonstrate compliance with CMMC, leveraging our Microsoft 365 product offerings. And you probably caught me on a webinar or two or some blogs, talking about how to differentiate between our different cloud service offerings and how they map to compliance. This topic here is really near and dear to us, beginning with the very first days of the release of our Microsoft 365 government GCC High and DoD clouds, our US sovereign cloud. There's always been this natural tension between, these commercial organizations that operate out of the commercial side of the house, but also have enclaves or requirements or business units that need to operate within our government cloud offerings. And of course, if you start bifurcating your user populations between commercial and government, or you need to collaborate cross-cloud sovereign cloud with partner subcontractors, suppliers, or even your customer being another DIB or the U.S. Department of Defense, that historically that's been somewhat limited in terms of that collaborative experience, given that the government and enclaves are isolated, right? And they did prohibit a lot of that collaboration. So today we're going to talk about the new capabilities that we've been looking at and talking about coming for years, but we now have available, and we'll be introducing here today about being able to collaborate across our sovereign cloud boundaries. That would include between commercial and government, etc. But we needed to take a step back, right? If you look at this ask, it's like, hey, we just need ubiquitous sharing. We need to be able to turn on B2B guest sharing so that we can do it just like we can in commercial. But in talking to the various different stakeholders, whether it was U.S. Department of Defense or a lot of the defense industrial base primes and even our SMB customers, we also recognize that you have a natural boundary there to help protect controlled unclassified information and so forth. So would it be wise to just open up ubiquitous or more of what we would refer to as organic collaboration to a higher side environment? I think the short answer is most people agree that it needs to be limited, right? But is it so restrictive that you can't do it at all, as we started off with on day one of the release of GCC High? And that answer is a negative as well. So let's look at really the different trust levels that we can establish so that you can be able to enable collaboration, but do so within a governance model that would work for your organization. So you can think about it in terms of levels of trust, right? Naturally, if you go and deploy into a single tenant and the organization, let's say your entire enterprise has a user population within a single tenant, naturally you're going to have the highest level of trust. Doesn't mean that you trust everybody in your tenant to the same level. There's a lot of multinational organizations, in which case you may have higher levels of trust for, let's say, the defense business unit as you would compared to, let's just say, other foreign business units that would have competing jurisdictional requirements and so forth. So you may end up with a scenario where you have different levels of trust within your tenant, but at the end of the day, you're going to have the highest level of trust as compared to starting to collaborate beyond the boundary of your individual tenant. So, from that perspective, we've always built a lot of collaboration to be most ubiquitous within the tenant boundary, meaning all the user population or guests that you have within your tenant, being able to collaborate more, I would say, ad hoc within your tenant. Now, as you start to introduce organizations, especially many of the defense industrial base that need to straddle cross-sovereign cloud solution, well, now they're in a scenario where you have some of your users that are in commercial and some of your users that are in GCC high or more complex organizations outside the DIB, where you'd have either requirements for many tenants based on geographical location or various different compliance requirements. But naturally, you'd have a single legal entity wanting to be able to straddle multiple tenants and do so in a manner that feels like you're one organization, right? That you have the ability to see everybody in the address book and to be able to more freely collaborate. So that's not the same level of trust that you would have in a single tenant, but it is more broad in terms of the fact that it's still your users, right, of your single legal entity or company that are cohabitating in these multiple tenants. So we call that complex org. That's a second ring. Then you get out into scenarios where you have suppliers, business partners, subcontractors, etc., in which you have limited trust, but you have a higher level of trust than you would just an ad hoc, right? Oftentimes, as we've been talking to defense industrial-based primes, we would consider these to be more of ones that you can establish an agreement with, like a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, that would establish to say, hey, you manage your environment to compliance, let's say with CMMC level 2, so do we. So let's establish an agreement between each other so that we can actually set up a trust so that we can share, for example, controlled unclassified information between our two organizations, but within the governance policies that we would define, and I'll get into that in a bit more detail. So that's that level 3. Then you get that more organic, more traditional B2B ad hoc viral ability. A lot of folks think that that should just be completely prohibited out of, for example, a GCC high tenant. Truth is, a lot of organizations are true enterprise. They're operating out of GCC high, even for the commercial side business. In that case, they do still have valid requirements for being able to do organic collaboration, especially in cases where you would have less sensitive information, such as collaborating on projects that would not include controlled unclassified information. So, fourth ring with organic cloud is very relevant even for GCC high customers. So now we introduce cross-tenant access settings. So cross-tenant access settings give you the ability to establish those trusts, right? You can say tenant A trusts tenant B, or as I go through this conversation here today, it would be like Contoso Aerospace trust Fabricam Defense. And you have the ability to establish not only a trust so that you can be able to give people access to resources within your tenant, you can also establish who has access outside of your tenant to other resources that are hosted, for example, by your partners. More on that to come. It's not just the sharing, it's also looking at other conditional access policies that you may define. By way of example, doing device authentication or checks for compliance on devices are critical within CMMC, for example, saying that not only do I want you to authenticate and do multi-factor authentication, I also want you to come with a trusted device, right? Something that's managed and to the NIST 800-171 standard, et cetera. So that is a critical part of it. So cross-tenant access settings do enable that trust and to honor multi-factor authentication and to honor even compliant devices. We can do runtime checks, Azure accessing resources. So gives an opportunity for you to apply these policies, not just for your traditional office workloads. So if you think about sharing in Office 365. It may be giving somebody access to a document library or a document and making sure that they can protect, like, for example, controlled unclassified information. It could also be in Azure for hosting an application or, for example, administrative duty that you would have within your tenant. This is just really a review. So in this particular collaboration framework, in that second ring, the complex org, very common within this space to say that you would have some foot that would be in commercial, so let's just say for your foreign user populations or your commercial business unit, and you'd also straddle with a GCC or GCC high tenant. In this case, given the conversation around straddling cross-sovereign cloud, the assumption is here today that we're talking about GCCI and Azure government as it's paired in that complex org. And then business partners. Business partners, as I mentioned, could be you collaborating with the DoD proper, or it could be collaborating with those that are in commercial or GCC. So let's look a little bit more about cross-tenant access settings. So there's a concept now of both outbound and inbound. This is really fundamental change in the way that we've historically enabled external sharing. In the past, you could control what kind of access that you grant inside your tenant. You didn't have really a lot of that access to manage what is outbound, right? So you can say, hey, I want to control which of my users are accessing resources that are outside of my tenant. Why is that important? Well, if you're a user that's in GCC high, you don't want them having necessarily ubiquitous access to a bunch of commercial resources, because you have a higher cross-section, of course, risk for data spillage if they're working outside of those guardrails. So you can control that now. It gives you an opportunity to say that you either do trust that organizations you're sharing with or not. Now, if you look at inbound and say, I want to allow for external users or users from another tenant to access resources within my tenant. So that is leveraging our B2B guest model, which I'll talk about more in detail. Then, of course, if you look at what I mentioned around devices, it's not just user authentication, it's device authentication. Gives you that ability to say, hey, I have devices that I manage in my organization, and we define, let's say, a standard. It'd be NIST 800-171 for CMMC Level 2 compliance that's applied to my devices, and I want to share that information externally to my partners, right? So you can actually say my managed or client devices are controlled, and that I'm allowed to allow that to be shared beyond my tenant boundary. And of course, again, coming back inbound or outbound, you can be able to encrypt data or protect it using our Microsoft Purview set of capabilities. So why are we talking about this in the first place? Well, when we first established the US Sovereign Cloud, it was purpose-built to the specification for US Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guide. That's a SRG Impact Level 5. Right, unclassified, but a very heavily restricted environment. Those IL5 controls really did prohibit any kind of sharing outside of their boundary, what's called a border cloud access point, right? The BCAP was really a network and boundary that would prohibit any kind of external sharing. And DoD has begun to open up a number of paths to be able to do sharing. Probably have joined some of their meetings here recently, hosted out of DoD tenants, but to start off with, it was very guarded and locked down. We found pretty quickly that it was too restrictive, meaning and managing the entire environment to the IL5 control set really did, it restricted, especially a lot of the commercial organizations, the defense industrial base, or even scenarios that the DoD had in collaboration with law enforcement and GCC or American Red Cross and commercial, et cetera. Everybody's been asking and demanding to have access to collaboration that actually is outside of this sovereign boundary or this isolation boundary, right? There's also other sovereign clouds, just so you know, that will never have sharing. As you can imagine, our air-gapped clouds, the ones for classified information like Azure Government Secret and Top Secret. This will never apply to. Naturally, they have air-gap requirements. So without further ado, we've introduced the cross-cloud collaboration. It is across all the unclassified sovereign clouds. The ones that we have available today, of course, are those for GCC High, topic for our webinar. Also the DoD cloud. There's actually a bit of overlap between GCC High and DoD cloud. They share the same identity provider with Azure Government. And then, of course, there is that China cloud over there. You'll notice that there is no collaboration between the US sovereign clouds and China by design. In terms of looking at the mesh, you can be able to collaborate between China and commercial. It's valid for some of my larger DIB prime customers. So what is Azure Active Directory B2B? Good question. So it essentially is the ability to do guest access, external guest access within a tenant. So in this particular case, you see you have two tenants. In there, you got one user in each tenant. Contoso Aerospace is the resource tenant, and ultimately you've got that member access to a resource that is hosted inside the same tenant. It's just a matter of authorization. You've got a member user B that's in the Fabricam Defense tenant, right? And at this point in the illustration, there's no external access. So what we can do is enable you to provision or invite, as we would say, a guest user for user B into the resource tenant, in this case, Contoso Aerospace. Give them a guest user account, it's like a shadow identity, that has access to that resource. It's really more of an authorization concept, right? But at the end of the day, anytime they need to authenticate, they're going to be redirected back to their home tenant, in this case, Fabricam, to authenticate, right? So when we say external user or B2B user or external guest user, those are referring to that ability to establish a guest type user inside of your tenant. So just looking at the core B2B scenarios for cross-cloud collaboration, in this case, it's a bit of a review. As an IT admin of Fabricam Defense, you can say, I trust Contoso Aerospace, so I'm going to allow for outbound collaboration from the Fabricam Defense tenant to the commercial cloud, in this case, Contoso Aerospace. And of course, as an IT administrator of Contoso Aerospace, you're going to allow or deny access into their tenant inbound. So it is bidirectional. You have to set up cross-tenant access settings in order to make this work. You're going to have cross-tenant access settings in the Contoso Aerospace tenant that trusts Fabricam, and inside the Fabricam Defense tenant that trusts Contoso. So you establish that bidirectionally, both inbound and outbound. So let's just go really quickly through the authentication flow. Kind of helps you to understand how a B2B guest account works in this particular scenario. So the first thing is you have a resource. You give somebody access to, let's say, a document that's in the Contoso Aerospace tenant, right, that commercial tenant. It could be a document, it could be a document library, it could be a team, it could be, an Azure AD integrated application that you host, or Azure Access, etc. Anytime that somebody goes to access that resource, it's going to redirect to the identity provider that is paired with that resource. In this case, it's on the commercial side of the house. It's going to redirect you to login.microsoftonline.com. Key here, differentiation commercial equals.com. Number two, user's going to enter in their credentials. In this case, it's a user coming from Fabricam Defense from GCC High, in which case it's a government identity. The worldwide or commercial identity provider, secure token service is what STS stands for, will recognize that that is not a user that is in the commercial cloud, that it's actually a user over in the government, or in this case, GCC High Cloud. So it will then check to make sure, is that cross-tenant access setting policy established in the tenant? If true, meaning it does recognize that the Fabricam tenant is trusted, then it'll also go into a validation to make sure that that user actually exists as a guest in the tenant, right, in the resource tenant. If the guest does exist in the commercial tenant, right, into the Contoso tenant, then it's going to say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and allow for this cross-cloud collaboration to occur. Then it's going to request, make a request across the sovereign cloud to the GCI tenant, and it's going to then relinquish over to the identity provider, secure token service for Azure government, GCC High, and of course, it's going to do a check on the other side. Does the Fabricam tenant trust Contoso? So it's going to check for some cross-tenant access settings, and then of course it's going to validate that the user exists in the tenant to start off with. If both are positive, then it'll move on and redirect the end user to now the login page for login.onmicrosoft.us. So the US is the extension in this particular case. You know, that you can differentiate between the login page between commercial and government because the URL is .us. User's going to authenticate. As soon as they're done authenticating, it issues a trust token, in this case something called an OpenID OAuth token, and then it'll exchange it back to the commercial side, and then the commercial side will give access to the application. So most of this is going to be pretty transparent to the end user. They'll go to access the resource, they'll plug in their user ID, it'll redirect them to sign in wherever it is that they always sign in at, and as soon as they're done, it'll give them access back into the resource that they requested. So the fact that that resource is in another tenant, pretty transparent unless you want it to be otherwise. Some of my customers do brand their login pages so that you can clearly identify that you're on one side or the other. The cross-cloud guest access or cross-cloud B2B, it's intended to have the exact same experience that you're familiar with, same cloud. So, for example, the redemption process for doing the invitation and to accept the invitation and all that is, you know, it's identical to the commercial side environment. And it does give, of course, ubiquitous access as you allow to resources that you host out of your tenant. I like to point out here on this slide, so I threw up the fact that there's, you know, all the Azure AD integrated apps too. We're not just talking about Microsoft 365. You're also any of your enterprise applications or other, you know, SaaS applications that you host from your tenant. Let's talk about the collaboration modality. So there's been the ability to do quote unquote federation, right, for a long time now. For federation, you have the ability to do so within teams. So that would include, for example, chatting with people or seeing their free busy information for exchange, or being able to do file sharing and so forth that would leverage a one-time passcode, email-based authentication. So those have been around and won't be labeled that because we've had that capability for years now. But when you get into what the new capability for cross-cloud is now what we're talking about, rich collaboration. So the ability to do this same cloud has existed. So two tenants in GCC High or two tenants in commercial are available today. Now we're enabling it for that cross-cloud between commercial and GCC High as well. So in public preview, we have the core capabilities, which is all the Azure Active Directory work that was done to support external B2B guest user accounts. So that's the authenticated application access and a lot of the web flows that you would have for web applications, even SharePoint, online document libraries, OneDrive for Business, etc. We also have private previews already underway and public previews that are coming online for the ability to do this in teams. Now, you may wonder why the two different. At the end of the day, one took a dependency on the other, right? So Azure Active Directory had to deliver the cross-cloud access settings and go GA with that before Teams was really able to do the work that they needed to do in order to build that guest access into, for example, authenticated meeting join and for group access. That is coming here. Cautiously optimistic that we'll have both a public preview coming soon as well as general availability by the end of this year. Official stance is that it'd be closer to the beginning of next year. Quick recap, just on a single slide, saying here's all the ability to do cross-sovereign cloud collaboration. You can do it with Teams, not only with files, but also with chat and meetings. You can do it with Exchange Online. That would include calendaring, free busy information sharing, etc., sending email that is encrypted, etc. SharePoint, OneDrive for Business for sharing and co-authoring, co-editing. That's a really key feature, one of the most heavily demanded capabilities. It's not just sending somebody a document back and forth, right, via an email attachment. It's now being able to co-author a document with your partners that are coming from somewhere else, and then the SSO into your applications. So the Teams cross-cloud anonymous meeting join is now been released to all tenants for the ability for you to join a meeting cross-cloud. So if you host the meeting out of commercial and you want to join it from GCC High, you can now join it using the Teams rich client and vice versa. Now, the best experience that we've seen with customers to join those meetings is actually go into the Teams client and join it. There has been some peculiar behavior right now with joining the meeting from Outlook and still preferring the browser, especially if you had selected remember this checkbox or whatever on the browser. But anyways, the key is that this is available. We do kind of encourage you for the time being to join the meeting from Teams, but you do get this nice anonymous meeting join experience from the rich client as opposed to having a redirect to a browser. However, there's still a bifurcation in terms of the ability to do authenticated join of the meeting, same cloud, but for joining the meeting from cross-cloud is still anonymous. It's the way it's been for all time up until now. With the release of the authenticated meeting join, the attestation, now will introduce the ability for you to join meetings authenticated from wherever you come from, whether it's a same cloud, cross-cloud Microsoft, or even from other identity providers that would include support for one-time passcode and so forth. Really heavily demanded feature on GCC High and DoD environments, because naturally you want to make sure you know who all is in a meeting, especially if you're going to discuss controlled unclassified information. Also have the Teams cross-cloud guest access. So that's Teams team or Teams group. We started off calling them Microsoft 365 groups, and then of course as they evolved into Teams, their Teams channels and so forth. But this is the ability to invite an external guest B2B user into your tenant and add them as a member to your team. Good. I just want to hit on a couple of concepts. We have limited time today. Maybe as part of the Q&A, we can go into this a bit more detail. But there is the big question is, okay, Microsoft, you've given us this ability to do cross-cloud collaboration now. We've been asking for it for years, and thank you for delivering it, but okay, how do we now protect our controlled unclassified information beyond the cross-tenant access settings? So CTAS is nice, but it is still tenant boundary. It's not user by user, right? So if you start getting into the user by user set of protection policies that are required, now you're going to introduce our Purview product family, right? So Purview includes, for example, our information protection, where you can be able to define sensitivity labels and apply them to documents or to content or to teams. And if it's a highly sensitive information type, such as controlled unclassified information, especially CUI specified, like ITAR export control, you can even apply encryption. The encryption is going to be done on the home tenant. And there's now capabilities where you can be able to automatically apply MPIP encryption on documents, such as identifying and automatically labeling all documents inside of a team, for example, a highly sensitive team. We've got data loss prevention as part of the Purview information suite that give you the opportunity to prohibit data from exfilling from your tenant based on various different policies, or in some cases you may decide to automatically encrypt based on those policies. So you can allow external sharing, but you may restrict it by, for example, applying an MPIP sensitivity label. There's entitlement management as well. So imagine in a world where you've got a new guest user that you've invited into your tenant, and you want to give them access to a resource. Well, you could do it more ad hoc, saying you could like click the share button on an individual document. But what we've been looking at is more of a design paradigm where you would, instead of giving them ad hoc access to a resource, you would give external users access through what are referred to as access packages, right? So this entitlement management feature is available as part of our G5 identity governance and GCC High or E5 if you're in commercial. And it does give you the ability to define these packages. So the packages are basically the ability to say, if I'm going to add a guest user, let's say from Fabricam Defense to this access package, I can automatically give them access to a security group in Azure Active Directory. I can assign them a membership to a team channel, or I could give them access to some applications, etc. Another way of viewing it is that you've got some users that are in Fabricam Defense, and you're giving them access to an access package. The nice thing is it's a grouping of access to different resources, and if you revoke that access, it automatically cleans up all the permissions and everything that they were given. So it keeps it really clean in terms of being able to apply permissions. Maybe those external users are not allowed to have access to controlled unclassified information, so the access packages would be very specifically for parts of your or content within your tenant that is unregulated, versus maybe those that are U.S. persons and whatnot may have an access package that would align with data handling for example, ITAR information or whatnot. So then you say, well, how do I know to remove them? Well, we got a feature for that too. So as part of entitlement management, you got access reviews. Just a really high level access reviews are the ability to see what permissions people have access to, and to actively, more proactively, I should say, review those on a regular basis as part of your governance policy, and to revoke access if it's no longer applied. So you can imagine how that would work. It's somebody's given access to a access package or to a specific Microsoft 365 team that has confidential information in it, that you can go and periodically review that and assign it to people that you delegate, maybe the owners of the team or other governance administrators within the organization that would do those access reviews, and could not only do a full complement of logging of what people have access to, but also to revoke it if it's no longer required. This is one of the coolest features of this, just seeing what people have access to if you don't know, right? Just discovering that in the past has been less than trivial. And the second part is great, is you can see when they've accessed it, right? So somebody has access to, say, administrative rights to something, and they haven't even accessed the resource in a year or two, then should they have access to it? Probably not. So that's a great new feature. Also, don't forget about applications. We get to been around the axle with Productivity Suite and Office 365. You can also talk about, even those Azure AD integrated apps that you have that would include enterprise applications that you host out of Azure Active Directory. It also could include even SaaS applications you see here, like Box and Salesforce. We have a leave behind. We'll give you a number of links that we compiled together for cross-cloud B2B. We'll continue to evolve this, of course, over the release of various different public previews and so forth. But we're super excited about it. And with that, we'll dive into the questions and discussions.
Great. Thanks, Richard. That was really a great rundown of everything. There's a lot there. It's pretty heavy content from a non-technical perspective. Those that are technical probably comes a little more natural too. I know you talked about this a little bit in the presentation. Put this a little bit in perspective. I mean, I know for us, it's been something that's been asked fairly. Almost everyone asks for this type of thing. How much is this going to impact, the user community in GCC High and the adoption rate probably as we move forward with GCC High?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the start of the journey for virtually every customer that we've had is to initially set up an enclave. Now, in the enclave, the benefit of an enclave is it's got a nice clean boundary, maybe simple to go through, let's just say a DibCAC or CMMC assessment. But truth of the matter is that most folks either do not like the experience of having to do a swivel seat, meaning that they're having to have two accounts that they log into commercial and a separate account that they log into the enclave with. But there's also higher risk there of data spillage, especially if you give people discretion on which account to use. So oftentimes they'll favor the one that they use the most, oftentimes the commercial side, in which case, it's not as secure as one way seems. So this capability really opens up a path that's been demanded for so long, as to say, I've got to give people access to my commercial side environment, right? And I need to do so from, GCC High. So this ability is to say, instead of having a swivel seat, we can actually migrate people into GCC High and let them actually operate out of there full time. So it has a higher security posture, but then you can retain access back to your time card or your, HR or other enterprise systems that are in commercial, and just generally to operate like one company, right? So that's one set of scenarios, just one organization, legal entity, that second ring, if you remember. The other part is really enabling all the supply chain. Like just almost every DIB prime contractor I work with has had to manage external users in their own directory, meaning that they have to give them an account. They usually have to give them some access, like coming in through a VDI station, workstation, or physical device, etc. And really, it gets to be pretty onerous for the supply chain, to especially those small businesses that they've got like a dozen credentials. They sign into one prime contractor with a different set of credentials than the other. So this gives you a way to start to securely enable collaboration, not only between your organization and straddling cross-sovereign cloud, but also true B2B scenarios with your supply chain.
Yeah, I think it's a massive piece there that I think is not always intuitive, in the fact that if you can then give access to those third-party applications, you can have someone dedicated on the DoD side working DoD work, but still fill out their timekeeping that's attached to maybe a commercial tenant identity, and that will enable a lot more efficiency with folks who are working in that enclave environment. And I think to kind of what you alluded to, give companies a lot more comfort to letting folks fully migrate and operate out of GCC High all day, and still have access when they need to content or capabilities on the commercial side. I know we talked about a couple of different things. Are there any specific maybe user-based scenarios or user-based cases that you see this playing out within your customer base?
Yeah, there's been a ton of discussion around formalizing a number of reference architectures. One of the things I hit on towards the end, I try to keep the level of technical depth of this particular webinar, more like a level 150 or so. But as we start to get into it, the first question is, okay, how do I enable the scenario? Meaning, can I be able to collaborate cross-sovereign cloud? Now the discussion, as you can imagine, is pivoted to data protection. So a lot of the definition of, okay, if I'm going to allow people in, how well am I going to be able to govern access to specific resources? Like, for example, a lot of times, if you look at features of our platform, are specifically designed to be easy to use for end users. And what that does translate to is more, I would say, viral or ad hoc sharing scenarios, right? So you have to come and lock them down, but not so much that it's unusable or defeats collaboration. So the scenarios that really have come up are, for example, not only the cross cloud within a single organization, but like, for example, this whole concept architecture of what we call a meet me tenant, extranet tenant, resource tenant, etc. Yeah. So we're seeing like DIB prime contractors that will likely be setting up these meet me or DIB enclaves, and that's where they would host a program, right? So they would invite in the supply chain for that program. You'll collaborate on that program content, keep it within a boundary, and then have a very tightly controlled way of exfilling information from that boundary. DoD has talked quite a bit about these enclave approach, McEwen and Bosjanek, et cetera, here recently, because it is going to be that first big step to helping to secure the supply chain.
Absolutely. I know a little foreshadowing there on our next session, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. I know the classic example we have every client of us talks about is on that business development side. They have a business development team, especially if that BD team doesn't do exclusive DoD work. They work in civilian agencies or commercial work, and they have collaborative partners in their supply chain. Trying to get that to all navigate and get them to function, I think just creates a lot of opportunity for us to do some things and relieve some of the pressure and the pain points that we have with our clients in that area. You mentioned data spillage a minute ago. Can you just explain for a second when you say data spillage, for those who maybe don't understand that term or realize it on the audience, maybe talk a little bit about what data spillage is considered, and then obviously I think we're all aware that could be a potential problem if you start sharing without really watching it and governing it appropriately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the context, data spillage, if you talk to a lot of the intel or defense community, they always think of it as classified information spilling into an unclassified environment. You could use the same concept here. It's that you manage an environment, let's say you manage an enclave in GCC High and Azure government, and it is very tightly controlled. You've implemented all the necessary configuration and policies in order to get compliant with DFAR 7012, CMMC Level 2, NIST 800-171, and 1,000 more acronyms, right? And then on the commercial side, yet not so much, right? The commercial side, there's, it's multinational or it's truly commercial, in which case maybe even untenable for you to configure it to that control set. Downside is if you give somebody access to both sides, well, they may inadvertently or sometimes even consciously use the commercial side when they shouldn't. And it could be that they send themselves an email, or they send an email, or they attach a file to a commercial meeting, or some other way. What it means is that you've got controlled unclassified information that is intended to be in the regulated environment, and it's spilling because you've now sent it to the commercial side environment. And the truth of the matter is, and this is a big talking point that I always like to point out, it's not always your people that you have to deal with, right? It's not that you know, you have to train your employees to say, hey, don't put controlled unclassified information in commercial. You know, it could be bad for your employment, or for even, you know, if it's export controlled for you know, keeping out an orange jumpsuit. But for a lot of times people expect that you are compliant, so they're going to be sending you email or whatnot, or content, expecting that you're compliant. And if they send it to your commercial side, you're going to be in a scenario where you've got a data spillage, right?
Fair enough. Yeah, it's you know, unfortunately, users tend to be like water. They always take that path of least resistance. And if you start opening up things without the proper amount of conversation with your team, with education from your team, continuing to maintain that, you know, education levels around handling CUI and what's proper and what's not proper and what you can and can't do. Hopefully that helps to continually get that message out there. Or be careful, even if you can share something, maybe you shouldn't share it, or you really shouldn't have to do it or be able to do it. I think we'll get into some of those other information protection DLP questions as we go into the questions. Before we shift into that, you know, you mentioned memorandums of understanding earlier on in the conversation. I think it's really important to talk about the fact that when you are considering sharing with another organization and letting them into your GCC high cloud, it's really critical to have an awareness of what that company does and what their security posture is, not just from DFAR 7020, but also from the fact that, are you going to be able to inherit those conditional access checks, those compliance checks? How confident are you in their security posture that you're comfortable sharing information with them? There is a business component to this before you start opening up the doors and allowing data to go through. So with that, let's bring Karen back in and maybe read through a couple of the questions and kind of walk through them a little bit, as we have a few minutes left.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes left. We have a lot of questions, and a lot of these are pretty technical. So I'm going to, I think, probably just start at the top, for lack of a better place to start. I'm assuming you both can see these questions as well. So as I read them, you'll be able to, you know, read along also. For our audience, anything that we don't get to, I'll make sure that both Bill and Richard get copies of the questions, and they'll be able to answer them, and we'll send that out along with the other resources from the webinar. So first off, the question, can we use Azure conditional access policies for specific cross-tenant entities?
Yes, absolutely. Cross-tenant access settings is an implementation of conditional access policies. I'd say the broader spectrum is to say that as you look at securing content within your tenant, you may get much more granular in the way that you apply those conditional access policies. Like, by way of example, you may say that there is a team, and that for access to that team, you are going to restrict access based on group membership, but also enforcing a device policy, right? Versus some other team that has got unregulated data, in which case you may not check the device policy. So there's granularity now. We've even got features coming out that you can integrate in with conditional access policies to even do levels of assurance. In the past, we kind of called that like step-up authentication or step-up authorization. Super excited about this. A lot of it's coming about as a result of the cybersecurity executive order. But it gives you the ability to say, hey, MFA is not just good enough. You want to access this resource, we're going to have a conditional access policy that says you need to have strong authentication, maybe FIDO2 key or derived credentials with a smart card, etc. So 100%.
Is that basically the same set of capabilities are available in traditional conditional access, including geolocating and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we started off with that being the most popular thing, is the geofence. Truth is, a lot of people can still spoof IP addresses. So we've kind of paired that together with unphishable multi-factor authentication and device claims as well. So it's kind of moving more towards like a zero trust model. Where like location based is still super relevant is, like, for example, if you set up a VDI farm like an Azure Virtual Desktop environment, that will be a set of internal private IP address, can't be really spoofed, right? So you can use that and say people who can connect in through the VDI, Azure Virtual Desktop, they can't connect from anywhere else if they're external, or some combination.
Excellent.
Great, thanks all. Okay, next question. What is the best way to prevent files with a specific sensitivity label being shared with trusted tenants with this new feature? Would that be DLP?
So it's really the whole Purview family of products. So Purview now is our branding that includes information protection, data loss prevention, and compliance in general. What you're finding is with the Purview, you have the ability not only to define what the sensitivity label is, so a sensitivity label may say only this group of people can read it, period. All right. And that can include guest users, external guest users, but then to apply that sensitivity label to an entire team. So Purview is going to automatically apply a certain data loss prevention. It's kind of a loaded question, though. There's a lot of configuration that you can do to prevent those files, some of which are going to be more permission-based, what we call like RBAC, role-based access control, versus others that you would prohibit via encryption, right, such as information protection.
Great. Okay, thank you. Next question. So if we are in GCC High, can we share outside GCC High where they can only view? Is there any ability to allow them to edit in GCC High, but still not download or save the information locally? And then Timothy has a follow-up to that. What about collaboration with non-MS tenant users?
So yeah, there's a feature of SharePoint Online that also translates to OneDrive for Business into Teams. This is more for your document management, right? Document storage, where you can be able to do limited access. So limited access would be that it's enforced by conditional access policies to say that, hey, if you either don't multi-factor authentication or you come from an untrusted device, you may not completely block it, but you would only give them a read-only view or a browser-based view and disable all that. Now, a lot of my customers do also want to have a full rich client experience as well. So that's where you get into like that architecture I was describing before to say, you can leverage that limited access capability, but there's also this concept of saying that you may still need to, like, for example, host Azure Virtual Desktop or some VDI instance, and that becomes your pane of glass. It's inside of your compliance boundary, and you would prohibit data exfiltration from that client device that is virtualized.
So if I'm kind of translating all that right, there's a lot of different ways to cut that. There's a lot of different ways to configure that, whether it's basic SharePoint and team setting, document storage settings into the labeling and sensitivity pieces. There's, depending on what your business case is, you've got several different ways to enable the same limitations or restrictions, whether that's being downloading or printing or even being able to just view and access content. Great. What's up next, Karen?
Okay. Next, question on DLP. DLP is a powerful service when enabling B2B. At the moment, the CAN definitions for data protection are fairly generic and common in the commercial space. Are there plans for Microsoft to provide DLP definitions or dictionaries that align with the GCC and GCC High customer base?
Controlled unclassified information sensitivity labels, right? Yeah, that's a huge debate. There's over 30 different categories for CUI, and what combination do you apply? Short answer is yes. We do have a simple method that we'll propose for CUI labels coming. I would say that, is it going to work for every single customer? I think it's a good baseline, right? The big question that you're going to have and it's unique to each organization, is what types of CUI data handling do you have? And how do you want to differentiate one from another, right? For example, do you have one single definition for CUI that spans everything from PII to export controlled data, or do you have specific ones for export controlled data like ITAR? I think from an encryption perspective, you'll have different ones, but not 30, right? So yeah, it's good feedback. There's partners of ours. I would say, lean on Bill to say how you approach it there at C3. But there's absolute ton of discussion around how to standardize and describe, NARA definition of CUI and sensitivity labels.
Yeah, we've got a couple of different approaches on that. Our base approach is when we work with clients in this area, first piece is, let's educate about what the capabilities are and what the tools can do. Then let's talk about some common scenarios and best practices that we've seen from the wealth of clients that we've worked with. And the idea there is to empower our clients to be able to some extent customize what's right for them and their business. The ITAR CUI specified is a great example. Not everyone has it. And for those that do, we have to take a different level, a little bit of a different approach on. Those who do not cover anything that is data sovereign or export controlled, then we have a little bit more freedom to do some of the labeling on it. So we're trying to find the right balance, and we're constantly readjusting our service in that area to make sure that our clients are deploying what's right for their business. Great. So I know we're hitting the top of the hour. I think we do have a few more questions left, but those are the ones that we can certainly we can address offline and follow up with folks after the event. Karen, you want to wrap up, or do you want me, or should I talk about the next session first?
Sure. Yeah. Bill? Why don't you, if you could advance the slide deck. We'll be sure to send around contact information for everyone. And then Bill's got a preview for our next webinar.
So the whole idea behind this is a big deal. Cross-cloud has a lot of different layers to it. We're so excited to have Richard with us today to talk about the technical side of it, what's capable, what's available, some of those things around, access control and access packages and all the other different things you can do to configure it. Our next session on this, we're going to dive into a little bit about some different ways to mitigate risk around cross-cloud as well. That are a little bit beyond the out-of-the-box capabilities within Microsoft. Our good friend Jay Leask over at AvePoint is going to come in. We're going to talk a little bit about their governance product, which gives a little bit of additional capability at the workspace level, the team and the site level, to be able to kind of automate some of those configurations and be able to do some of these things at scale. Really great solution. Really excited to have Jay talk about it. And then what we're working on from a third piece about it is to bring in some industry folks to talk about tying that together with your vendor management program. Most folks today have some sort of qualification program for teaming partners. There should be a cybersecurity questionnaire component of that. How do we start linking that up with all the capabilities to make sure that at scale, when folks are creating projects, creating teams, creating proposals, that they're doing things smartly and appropriately without having complete micromanagement control on your environment. So both sessions, this one's scheduled for October 4th. The next one's going to be shortly after it. Really going to help paint the full picture of what we can do with cross-cloud collaboration. All right, Karen, back to you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. And then just as a reminder, in case anybody missed it at the beginning, we'll be sure to send out this presentation. We'll be posting it on our YouTube channel along with our website. We'll send out a link to access that. We will also send out answers to any of the questions that we did not get to. I want to say thank you to Richard and again to Bill. We really appreciate everybody's time, and thank you all to everyone who joined us. So have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.